Hey guys, this is God Saad for the Sad Truth. Another fantastic guest for you today. Today I've got on the docket Dario Fernandez-Morera. Let me just tell you briefly about him and then I'll cede the floor to him. He is an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Northwestern University. Two of his books, we'll spend most of the time talking about one of them, but I wanted to mention another one because it might be relevant to our conversation. So his most recent one is The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise, Muslims, Christians, and Jews under Islamic rule in medieval Spain. And his earlier book, more than 20 years ago, American Academia and the Survival of Marxist Ideas. How are you doing, sir?
Thank you for inviting me.
It's great to have you on. Before we start, I thought that I would point to people that I've created the perfect manwich, right? Not a sandwich, a manwich. I am in between the number one and number three guys on a recent ranking that came out listing the top 10 professors who supposedly helped the right. I'm not exactly sure how we do that, but number one is Jordan Peterson. Yours truly is at number two, and then you are at number three. So you want to comment about that ranking?
Well, again, we have had a short discussion as to whether the ranking is from the bottom or from the top. Because at the top, in number 10, but at the beginning of the ranking, is Dershowitz.
Right.
But you argue that it goes from 10 to 1, and therefore Peterson should be number 1. I don't know.
Yes, I think my interpretation is the right one, but in either case, why do you we're there now? Why do you think you're there? Is it largely because of the book that we're about to talk about?
I really don't know. I was surprised to find myself there because I'm such an innocent guy. And the commentator who puts me there says that the reason I'm there is because in my most recent book, I debunk very cherished beliefs of the left.
Right.
So go figure.
So let's start before we delve into the Andalusian myth. I thought we would talk about your earlier book, where you talk about, sort of the love affair that academia has with Marxist ideas. In a sense, both of the books are tackling, cherished ideas that academics hold and why it is that they might be parasitized with these ideas. So let's talk about the first one. What led you to write it, and what is the sort of summary of that book?
Well, between that book and this one, I also published several books on more literary matters. But I suppose what matters here is the ones that have to do with the issues that you mentioned already. I was led to write that book because I was noticing all around me the use of Marxist ideas, sometimes unrecognized, for all sorts of humanistic approaches. You would find that in critical theory, you would find that in sociological analysis, but all of them were using Marxist assumptions. And I thought that deserved treatment because I thought until now the issue, or you might want to call it a problem, I think it's a problem, had been dealt with not from a theoretical point of view. So in that book, what I did was I examined the foundations of Marxist theory as it applies to the study of the humanities. And the writings of then Soviet Union professors were marvelously useful because then you could see the similarity between what those professors were writing over there in the Soviet Union and what the professors over here in more recent times, even after the fall of the Soviet Union, were writing. And they were using the same types of premises. The professors here seemingly unaware that were simply repeating assumptions and in some cases statements used by academics in Marxist-Leninist Russia. It was amazing.
What is it that makes the mind of an academic in the West traditionally so enamored with these Marxist ideas, which have been put to empirical and historical tests and have been shown to repeatedly fail, but apparently it's always not the true implementation of Marxism? If only we could implement the true utopic communism, then we would show that it is the superior political and economic system. What is it that causes them to be so buffoonish about this stuff?
I actually have a chapter on that in that book that you mentioned. And before going into the psychological reasons, we could take a page from their own writings and say that their social conditions are conditioned in their own fault. I mean, if you look at the university is a macrocosm of a socialist state. See what I mean?
Sure.
So once the professors, the graduate student enters into the system, he is already being shaped by this highly socialized environment in which he lives. There are politburos, there is the socialization of the students. The students are given these dorms in which they live. The university controls where they go, all for their own good, where they go, the books they are going to read. It's an extraordinary example of a socialist institution. So of course they are being shaped by their historical conditions, and so their little minds are already being shaped in that direction. I mean, that's one reason.
You know, it's interesting that you say this, because sometimes when people ask me, you know, am I happy at my university or living in Montreal? And I usually say, I mean, yes, there are wonderful things about my university and wonderful things about Montreal. But I often, whenever I'm expressing frustration, I will refer to something that's kind of related to what you said, which is that Quebec in particular, I mean, Canada is already a very socialist state, but Quebec in particular is socialism on steroid, in that it really is always about the equality of outcomes, right? So typically the unions, the faculty unions, are there to make sure that everybody is roughly equal. So you could take a guy who is heading quickly on a trajectory for a Nobel Prize and a guy who's never published anything since the Dark Ages, and we want to find a way so that they are roughly equal, because then that would be fair and just.
Which is of course a pantomime.
Right.
Because we know very well that universities are extremely hierarchical, while at the same time they are constantly talking, especially now even more than ever, they have always done it, about equality and inclusion, which of course is nonsense when it comes to the facts of the matter, because you know that there are hierarchies and that there are spheres of influence, and they're the bien-pensant, and we know that, which again replicates what happens in a socialist state.
Very true.
That's what's happening. It has happening in all the socialist states. There's equality and so forth. Well, not really, because some people are more equal than others.
Now,
you know.
Yes, I'm sorry. So if you wrote the book, I think it came out in '96, correct?
Right.
So in the 21 years since, do you see that sort of there is a last bastion of Marxists that are still around, but it's no longer something that is in vogue? Or do you just see a new generation of Marxists being trained, or is it on its way out?
Oh, no. On the contrary, it just acquires new names and new dressings, and it continues. Critical theory is based on Marxist assumptions. Actually, many other practitioners don't even realize that because they don't know. They haven't gone back to the text. They haven't read the Soviet scholars' writings. So it's fascinating to watch this. It's in a way amusing to watch what goes on in the university.
Now, in your own sort of, not political trajectory, but your own thinking, oftentimes I joke with people when they say that they were, staunch progressives, and then I always say, and then eventually they grew up. So in your case, did you have sort of a trajectory where you started on one end of the political spectrum and then through your life you switched, or had you always been roughly the same guy you are today?
No, I never went through that process of transformation. I could say that I was martyred, so I didn't need to go through a trial and error. But maybe it was a combination of reasons that never made me fall into that category of, I was a very left-wing once, and then I saw the light.
Right.
No, I thought that it was stupid from the beginning.
Good for you. By the way, before we now, I'd like us to now quickly shift to your current book, your most recent book. You're a professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. Just as a side note, as a personal side note, the synagogue that my family belongs to, and my family, I mean that of my parents, not my own family, is called the Spanish and Portuguese Congregation in Montreal. Now, interestingly, it's as you may or may not, well, you would know given what you've written about. It's made up actually of all Arabic Jews, so it'll be Lebanese Jews and Iraqi Jews and Syrian Jews, but it's called the Spanish and Portuguese Congregation. So I thought this might interest you.
Would they fall into the Sephardic branch?
Yeah, they fall into. I mean, usually people say Sephardic. Of course, if you want to be more technical, some people will say it's Mizrahi, right, which is specific to the Orient Jews. But yes, usually for shorthand, people just say Sephardic Jews. Yes.
That's not as simple as that. Okay.
Right. So okay, let's get down to your most recent book. Now, before I ask you to give us the synopsis, and then we're going to spend much of today talking about that book. I've actually, so you may have heard of the term that I've been pushing around, ostrich parasitic syndrome, which consists of a set of cognitive biases that people typically commit, and I usually use it when I'm describing how willfully blind people are regarding issues dealing with Islam. And I actually have used the example of Andalusia, I mean, independently, prior to knowing about your book, where, because I've heard so many people say, oh, but if Islam were so bad, then how could you explain the golden age where everybody held hands and loved each other in Andalusia? So it's uniquely exciting for me to be talking to you, because you are the expert who could debunk this damn myth for us. So,
which, by the way, doesn't mean that Islam cannot be wonderful. It's just that that's a bad example.
Fair enough. Exactly. Fair enough.
To capture the idea.
The narrative. Okay. So start us off with the general premise of the book, how you got interested in tackling this, how you went about. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good question. I was writing an article on Cervantes, Miguel de Cervantes, and as you know, the life of Miguel de Cervantes intersects in the last years of the 16th century. It intersects with the Islamic Caliphate, which, as you know, has been trying to, or had been trying, well, actually today is trying, had been trying to conquer the Christian Greek Roman Empire in the east and Western Europe in the west for centuries, since the late years of the 7th century have been trying to do that. And in the second half of the 16th century, the Islamic Caliphate, as you know, was led by the Turks. It was the Turkish Sultan was the Caliph of Islam then. And so Spain was in a dire struggle against the Islamic Caliphate of the Turks, which, as you know, had already taken over the Roman Empire and had conquered the Balkans, had conquered Greece, and had moved into Central Europe, had defeated the Hungarians, the Serbs, and was attacking Vienna, the forces of the Islamic Caliphate. They had come up through the Balkans. And so Cervantes was a soldier. He was a soldier of the Spanish army. And so he faced Islam in battle. And he fought the Muslims at Lepanto, the great naval battle where the coalition of the willing at that time defeated the great fleet of the Islamic Caliphate at Lepanto. And a few years later, when he was traveling from Italy to Spain, Muslim pirates, which, as you know, for centuries have been attacking the coasts of Europe, people don't know about this, the coast of Europe, and sacking the coastal towns and taking captives, slaves, and enslaving millions of people have been enslaved. There's a wonderful book by a guy named Davis called White Slaves, Muslim Masters. And he calculates that between 1500 and 1800 alone, and in North Africa alone, over 1 million white slaves from Europe were sold and bought. And Cervantes became one of them because these Muslim raiders attacked the ship in which he was, and he was captured and he was taken as a slave to Algiers, where he remained for 5 years until he was ransomed by the friars of the Trinitarian Order. The Trinitarian Order was one of two orders in Christendom dedicated exclusively to helping Christian slaves. There were two orders. Imagine the amount of slaves dedicated exclusively to helping the Christian slaves. And so the Trinitarian friars gathered the ransom and then freed him. So that led me to investigate the question of Islam in Spain once I had started looking at Cervantes and Islam, which eventually was published as an article, by the way. It's called that, Cervantes and Islam, a Contemporary Analogy, which is online. And so I began to investigate, and I realized that a lot that had been written, especially in English, about Islamic Spain was doubtful, if not an outright lie. So I thought that I should do something about this. And what happened was that the editor of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute had read my article on Cervantes and Islam, and he asked me to write an article for them, for one of their journals. And so I did. And he liked it so much that he said, why don't you write a book on it for us? And that's something that I already been thinking. So I went ahead and wrote the book for them, and that is the book. That's how it all started.
And what typically, so, as an empiricist, I know the broad range of methodologies that one might use within, say, the behavioral sciences to test, positive hypotheses and so on. Typically, in your case, is it that you are largely using archival records that would have been untouched, and you by unearthing them, you see new truths? Is that the general paradigm that one uses within your historical studies?
That is one thing. Another thing that has helped me is the more recent 20 years, 30 years archaeological work. Has helped a lot, especially in debunking the idea that the Christian Visigoth kingdom was a retrograde and obscure kingdom that was enlightened by this invasion. Nonsense. The Visigoths were actually more advanced than the Muslim conquerors. But yes, I do use a great deal of archival material, which is there. I don't know why so many scholars in the English-speaking world especially have not used it. Maybe because they don't read Spanish. They may read Arabic, but they don't read Spanish. So they were extremely ignorant of work that had been done in Spain, translating a lot of this material into Spanish, but also publishing about it. Great Arabists. I mean, the Spanish School of Arabists is just wonderful. But I should say something here, which is that perhaps one of the most useful documents is not a document in Arabic. The earliest and most reliable account of the Islamic conquest of Spain is not an Arabic chronicle. It is a Christian chronicle, and it is not written in Arabic. It is written in Latin. It's the so-called Chronica Mozarabica of 754, written only a few decades after the Muslim conquest. So that is a marvelous source for knowledge about the conquest and the early impact of that conquest. And there are other Christian sources that, again, English scholars have no idea of, but Spanish scholars do. Garcia Moreno from the University of Alcalá, for example, has written about this wonderful hymn, a Christian hymn from the Visigoth kingdom, just a few years after the invasion, in which it laments, these Christians lament in church in the north, lament the horrors of this conquest. So there's all this textual material from Christian sources, which are also very interesting because they present the viewpoint of the defeated,
right,
rather than the viewpoint of the conquerors, which is what you find in the later Arabic chronicles. So this Christian material is extraordinary. And then there is archaeology. Archaeology has been known in archaeology for a long time. I don't know again why the English scholars did ignore that. The Spanish scholars knew that. This is not a recent thing. Coins found in North Africa shortly before the invasion. And
Oh, we have what's his name? Oh boy, he looks pretty intimidating with that collar.
his name is Proba, and he's a great dog. And so it's coins. Is he going to be featured?
He is going to be featured. He's a star now.
You're going to be featured. These coins have on the ones they call for jihad.
Right.
These coins.
But wait a minute, Dario. Jihad is only about internal struggle. Why are you being an Islamophobe, man? Cut it out.
No, but these coins are talking about doesn't seem to be about improving themselves, but about war, religious war, right? That's what it seems to be about.
Got it. Now,
So yeah, jihad may mean that, but not in that particular case. Go figure.
so give us the usual storyline about Andalusia, hence the myth, and then the bottom line of what you discovered that shoots down that myth. Just give us the two positions.
Well, one of the positions is subdivided. The one position is that there was a conquest, but it was largely peaceful. There were peaceful treaties that the Christian lords and Christian leaders signed. So it was largely peaceful. And there is another variation on that, which is that there was no actual conquest, but some kind of migration. The Muslims migrated there, and they just settled somehow. I don't know. They expanded. They never used the word conquest. The word an expansion, migration, demographic explosion. I don't know. Whatever you want to use to describe that, that's one thing. But of course, what I'm going to say now has been said by Spanish scholars. I haven't discovered this. No, it was a violent conquest. And there was a big battle, and there was treason on the part of the nobility because there were internecine struggles within the political class in Spain. That's not new. And so one royal faction sided with the invaders. So that facilitated the conquest of the land. And then the methods used in war were methods tried and true already in the Middle East and North Africa. The invaders were largely Berbers who had been converted to Islam because of the prior conquest of North Africa, which was Christian.
And the conquest was also there done very peacefully by simply spreading candy to everybody, correct?
Right. There are all these wonderful Christian chronicles. There is even earlier a Christian chronicle called the Chronica Byzantia Arabica from 747. And it tells you all these details about the ruthlessness and very effective, great military campaigns. I mean, you may not like the methods, but they were very, very effective of the conquerors. So we have all this documentation. There is also archaeological evidence of a whole string of remains of churches that follow the routes of the conquerors, burn and destroy churches along along North Africa. So the Arabs coming from Arabia and Syria defeated the Christian Greek-Roman Empire, and then they moved on to defeat Berber tribes with terrifying methods. I mean, for the Christians and the Jews, as you know, the Muslims gave them the alternative of submitting or converting or dying. But for the pagans, who most of these Berbers were pagans, some were Christian, maybe even Jewish, but most of them were pagan. So there's no alternative for them. You either convert or die. And so the methods were ruthless, but they defeated these Berbers and they terrified. They decided to convert to Islam, and then they became part of the forces of the Islamic Caliphate and actually made most of the mass of the invaders in Spain, led by some Arab contingents, which were later reinforced by troops from Yemen and Syria. But the majority were Berbers from North Africa. And as I said, the methods were very, very effective. They have already been used in North Africa, have been used in the Middle East. If you fight us, then we are going to kill you. We're going to exterminate you, and we're going to take your women and your children as slaves.
Spoils of war.
And you cannot defeat us.
Right.
So, I mean, after a few battles in which the rest of the population and the rest of the soldiers saw what was happening, I mean, that demoralized them.
Right.
It was shock and awe, I call it. It was shock and awe. And also, there was this part of the methodology was to destroy the temples of the enemy and convert them into mosques. That demoralizes the population when they see what happened over there to the churches, and now they have become mosques. So there were all these methods that were extremely effective, and of course these warriors were fearless. There is a record by a famous Muslim historian of the 8th century who tells of the conquest of Persia by the Arabs. And a great and very pious Arab leader named Khalid, he tells the Persians that they should submit, because if they don't, they are going to meet an enemy that loves death more than you love life.
Boy, I seem to have heard this exact sentence very recently. So apparently there's an uninterrupted ideology that seems to be causing mayhem around the world.
In any event, you can see the effectiveness of this. I mean, these warriors really believe that. So in hand-to-hand combat, they had an advantage, a tactical advantage in battle. The populations, unless they could summon an equivalent kind of motivation, did not have this type of motivation. As you know, the Christians eventually summoned that.
Right.
And by the Pope calling upon a crusade, which is not the equivalent of holy war. Let's not make that mistake. A crusade is a unique event that only a Pope can call. It's not part of the teachings of the church. It's an exception, whereas jihad in the sense of sacred combat, not in the other sense of it's just part of the teachings. So that's how Christianity could eventually, and how the Spaniards eventually could defeat Islam, because they summoned something equivalent.
Well, I was going to say, what's interesting, part of the ostrich logic, in addition to the Andalusia myth, is of course but what about the Crusades, where typically people use that example to demonstrate how religious fervor is not some monopolistic thing, whereby the Christians have also done all sorts of atrocities. And of course, the reality is that the Crusades was a response to several hundred years of Islamic incursions. And if you look at the number that were killed, as I understand it, it pales in comparison to what we've seen the other folks do when they come into new territories, correct?
But the focus here should not be so much in the details of who killed more or what. The focus should be on the theory. And there is a theory within medieval Islam. I'm not saying that's what Islam of all times. In medieval Islam, by which you have to engage in this sacred combat to make the world submit. And even Khaldun, the great Tunisian historian, actually makes he himself the distinction between jihad in the Islamic sense and combat among the Christians. He states it very clearly. Jihad for us is an obligation. It's part of what we are as religious people. Whereas the Christians, war for them is some kind of non-religious activity.
Right.
Even Khaldun says that. And of course, one can read several books today that explain this distinction that we're making here between crusade and jihad, which are totally different conceptions.
Right. Now, okay, so myth one is they came in peacefully, either through migration, they were invited in, it was a natural movement of populations. That's not true. They came in violently. But I guess the typical Andalusian myth that we hear about is that once they're now settled within those regions, there is this beautiful harmony that takes place across the three Abrahamic religions, whereby Christians and Jews and Muslims live together in perfect equality, perfect tolerance, perfect peace. So tell us about that particular myth.
But there could not be equality because, of course, the other two religions and the members of the other two religions are in a juridical condition which is regulated by the Dhimmi, which is the system that medieval Islam imposed on those Christians and Jews who decided not to fight but to submit. So the Dhimmi was imposed on them, and they became Dhimmis.
Exactly.
And by definition, by juridical definition, I'm not saying this, I've been reading that from Spanish Arabists. Juridically, they were in a subaltern condition. Let me give you an example that is given by a great Spanish Arabist named Felipe Maello Salgado, and Salgado points out, among many examples he gives, if a Muslim killed a Christian for whatever reason, even intentionally, he must not be killed. He must not suffer the highest penalty. If a Christian kills a Muslim, even in self-defense, he must be killed. Yeah. And the reason was that the life of a Christian, as Mario Salgado and other Arabists point out, it was less valuable juridically than that of a Muslim. It was somewhat close to that of a Muslim woman, which was about half the value of a Muslim man. And that's evident in testimonies as well. For example, in cases where a Muslim was involved, a Christian could not testify against a Muslim. His testimony would not be valid. So there were all sorts of juridical stipulations that placed the Christian and the Jew, by definition, in a subaltern condition. So, of course, I mean, theoretically already, you cannot have equality.
Well, as a matter of fact, all those fractions that you're talking about, you're worth 1/4 and 1/6, all that is codified in Sharia, right? I mean, you just have to open Reliance of the Traveler, and you could see all those fractions. They're there for you.
You find all this in all sorts of medieval juridical treatises, from the Al-Muwatta, which was foundational for the law in Spain, to the Al-Tafri, the Risala, even the Leyes de Moros, still way into the 16th century. You can still read those treatises there, which Muslims were using, legal treatises, and you can read all that stuff in there.
And so maybe you could explain to us that when you enter the status of being a dhimmi, then one of the many conditions that sort of reinforce your third-class citizenhood is that you have to pay the jizya, which I've talked about often on this show, but maybe you could explain to us how the jizya was instantiated in the context of Andalusia.
Yes, that was part of being a dhimmi. You had to pay a tax to be allowed to live. I mean, you didn't pay a tax, you died.
Right.
And that tax was not only of monetary benefit to the rulers, was an extraordinary source of income, but also it was juridically intended to humiliate the dhimmi. The juridical treatises point this out. I mean, Malik ibn Anas in his Al-Muwatta points out the jizya is intended to humiliate the dhimmi and remind him of his subaltern condition. And you find that in other treatises as well, the same kind of statement. I believe it goes back to some place in the Quran, but I haven't gone into that. It's not my business to go into the Quran. But the jizya was, as I said, intended to remind the dhimmi of his subaltern condition.
Right. Now, one of the things that people don't appreciate about these dynamics is that, for example, I grew up in Lebanon, in arguably what would be considered the most progressive and modern of all Middle Eastern states. Very modern, the Paris of the Middle East, and all sorts of other euphemisms. But even in my context, right? I mean, never mind Andalusia, right? Beirut in the 1960s and 70s, prior to the Civil War, would have been the model of, quote, tolerance and cohabitation. Sorry? Yeah, but here's the thing. Even in that context, you still had the remnants of dhimmitude that were present. And the way it did that, right? Nobody came to our house and said, okay, Jews, it's time to pay the jizya today. But you instantiated your dhimmi status by being quiet, by not making too much noise, by knowing your place in society. Do you follow? Yes. So in other words, your dhimmi status varies depending on the ecosystem and the particular historical period, but there is no context where a Jew living under Islamic lands is an absolute equal. That doesn't happen, even in the context of the most progressive country and progressive setting like Lebanon. And so I could only imagine that in the case of Andalusia, it would have been a lot worse, right? When your Muslim overlord sees your beautiful young daughter and says, hey, I think we'd like to arrange a marriage, well, it might be difficult for you to aggressively say no. That would be, see, so all of these dynamics are always reinforcing the fact that don't forget that you owe us, if only for us tolerating you, correct?
And before I forget, another example that Mario Salgado gives has to do with marriage precisely. In Islamic Spain, a Muslim man could marry a Christian woman and have children with her. The children, of course, had to be raised as Muslims. A Christian man, however, could not marry a Christian woman. In fact, he better not look at a Muslim woman. A Christian man could not marry a Muslim woman, could not even look at a Muslim woman. So you can see how that already places in a subaltern position the Christian, and you can see how that affects the demographics as well. Because the Muslim man can marry a Christian woman, have children, the children will be raised as Muslims, but the Christian cannot marry the Muslim. See, that affects them. It's a brilliant system, if you will, of controlling and submission and transformation of the society.
And as somebody who studies evolutionary psychology, right, where I recognize the importance of the most valuable resource that men fight over, which is sexual access to women, then Islam is absolutely the most brilliant system that has ever existed, right? Because it codifies divinely every single one of the most basal male, blueprints, if you'd like. And so in that sense, it's brilliant.
It's a brilliant conception. Maybe it was inspired by God or not, but whether or not it was inspired by God, it's brilliant. There's so many other examples of what you're talking about. Even the approach to war that we had talked about earlier is brilliant. Imagine changing war from mere war into a religious duty.
Right.
I mean, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
But what for the rest of the world has been merely war, here is a religious obligation. It's just extraordinary.
Right. Now, okay, so the root of the Andalusian myth, from the perspective of, say, if you had a Islamic propagandist and you're trying to understand why he might promulgate this myth, well, we could trace it back all the way to the origins of Islam, where the world is divided into Islam coming into the world and spreading the light, and the pre-Islamic world where it was darkness, right? Everything was dark. That's why we have to destroy any cultural artifacts that predate Islam, because they're part of the darkness. So I can understand why the Islamic propagandists would want to create a myth that says, when we came into Andalusia, we spread light. What explains the fact that the Westerners, the apologists, are being parasitized by this myth? How do we explain that?
Well, before we go into that, 2 points that you raised while you were talking. One is that the conquerors did use members of the Christian and Jewish population as part of their bureaucracy. And so innocently, or maybe not, some scholars point out, well, look, there is that Jewish vizier over there, and there is that Christian functionary. Well, of course, they were using them as their servants, and that is the word they used, because they could not even use the word ally. You were not supposed to ally yourself with Jews or Christians, so the word used was servants. Of course, they used the bureaucracy they used them as bureaucrats to manage the population at large, so that sometimes confuse them. Well, look, how come that they have that Jewish guy or that Christian? Well, of course, they are using them.
But by the way, before you go on, I want you to continue your point. A perfect example of what you just said is Maimonides, right? Because Maimonides is the perfect example that is used to say, well, if the Muslims hated Jews so much, how do you explain the fact that he was the personal physician to the Sultan?
He was a good physician, so he used him. And by the way, he eventually fled.
Yeah, exactly.
For his life.
Anyway, so yeah, go on with your point.
And the other point is that indeed this destruction of the monuments of the past is another brilliant idea, because then it gives the impression, unless there is archaeology around or some surviving texts, that indeed the previous civilization was inferior to the Islamic one. And a wonderful example is this caliph, and scholars consider his reign perhaps one of the most brilliant times of Islam. I think it was Al-Mamun, but I may be mistaken. In 832, this Muslim caliph ordered the destruction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, because you cannot allow a monument from the past to compete with those created by Islam. So you destroy it. 2, it's pagan. It may have idolatrous markings or whatever. So you destroy it. So it's not only a matter of religion, it's also a matter of political know-how. It's brilliant, again. You destroy the past. And you even destroy the traces of your destroying things.
Right.
So it's like a blank slate.
Yeah. And
it impresses the Muslim population itself, because they see, of course, we're the greatest here. Look, where is the past? There's nothing. Right. The great Harun al-Rashid, the famous caliph of the 1009, very celebrated, he destroyed the great palace of the Persian king Khosroes. It's an extraordinary palace in what is today's Iraq. Right. For the same reason, extraordinary palace, because you couldn't allow that to compete with a great palace by Harun al-Rashid. Right. And the same thing with the transformation of great basilicas, into mosques. As you know, that happened. The Turks did that with Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. It was turned into a mosque until the so-called lay dictator Ataturk turned into a museum. But I was reading, by the way, that in 2015, the Muezzin was calling to prayer from one of those 4 minarets that the Turks built around Hagia Sophia. And then in 2016, now the Muezzin has moved inside the church, and now it's transmitting by electronic means the call to prayer. So rapidly, it's going back again to being a mosque. So, but again, this points to the brilliance of the system as far as making others submit. I mean, you don't have to tell them convert or whatever. No, you don't have to do that.
Right. Okay. So thank you for those points. So let's now drill down as to why the Westerners have been so keen on promulgating and defending that myth.
Yeah, that probably deserves a book in itself. There is a book by a Spanish professor of philosophy called ¿Por qué los intelectuales tratan al Islam de esta manera, whatever, but of course has been translated into English. And in my book, I deal with some of this, especially in the introduction. I think it's a mixture of factors. And what may work for a scholar may not work for another. And in some cases, one factor reinforces the other factor. Look, if you are a graduate student and you like exotic things and you go into Arabic studies and you get a degree in that, it's your life. You are going to try to present that material in as attractive a way as possible. So you block, maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally, you block things that might throw a bad light on the stuff that you love so much, in which you have invested your entire professional life. And in this word investment comes another factor, which is, that's my life, that's how I make a living, okay? So don't mess with it.
Right.
So there is that important factor of the stakeholder interest in the subject that we're talking about. But there are many other factors. There is, in some cases, Christianophobia, someone who may not be an Islamic studies professor, doesn't like Christianity, so he may try to raise Islam, medieval Islam, against medieval Christianity.
Right.
I think that some of the Enlightenment writers did that, and since then that has sometimes happened to deprecate Christianity, to put it down, to compare it with how Islam was much superior in so many ways. And enlightenment, in knowledge, in tolerance, and so on and so forth. Tony Blair, that politician from England, I quote him in my book, saying that in earlier times you would find more often, I'm paraphrasing, tolerance in Islamic lands than in Christian lands, says Tony Blair. So that's one factor. There is also the money factor, and there have been studies, and there's been a book on the subject, showing the enormous amounts of money that have gone into Islamic studies programs in the best Western, the most influential Western universities. And I think that it's a factor. Yale University accepted recently millions of dollars from some businessman, either Qatar or Saudi Arabia, or one of those places.
Well, Harvard is the same thing. Georgetown is the same thing. All the Near East institutes and departments are completely funded by a lot of these nefarious characters that then push that one narrative.
What do you expect? And then they do research into Islamic law. The center in Yale now is associated with the Yale University School of Law for the study of Islamic law over there. So they study all things about Islam except what you might expect them also to study, which is, what about the origins? What about, where did the Quran come from? How did Muhammad come to be regarded as a prophet? Stuff that scholars have done with Christianity forever. They study the historical. How did Christ, the historical man, exist? How did the Testament come down? But you don't hear about that with the texts of Islam in these great departments and these great research. They don't touch that.
So I think let me add one more reason to the ones that you've proposed. So I think that part of being, quote, a progressive today, which is what most academics identify as, is to sort of except the right wingers, is to self-flagellate at the altar of infinite tolerance. And one of the ways that you self-flagellate is to look to the other as good and look to yourself as bad. That is a measure of being an enlightened progressive, right? In the same way that there was an era where you couldn't be a bien-pensant and not go into psychoanalysis, right? Everybody was in psychotherapy because you had to look inwards to look at the bad things that you are, right? Well, being a Western intellectual is to self-flagellate about how bad you are. And so in a sense, it's a revival. This is now me proposing this. It's a revival of the noble savage myth, right? So until the Western white guy came along and, created war, all exotic people were only holding hands, making love, listening to John Lennon, but then they were corrupted by this brutish white man, right? So how could Muslim people be violent? They're beautiful, noble brown people who sing beautiful songs and make great food and have very hospitable culture. So could that be it? It's a form of fetishizing the other on the collective.
Yes, that's certainly part of it. And of course, there are variations on that take, which is that some of those peoples can actually be much more enlightened than the Westerners and much more knowledgeable, as in the case of medieval Islam. Medieval Islam was much more knowledgeable and enlightened than Western Europe, following that thing. So there's a variation on that. There's a noble savage, but some of those savages are not actually savages. They are very, very noble and very, very civilized.
Right. All right. Let's take this discussion. By the way, I want to show the book, which you were kind enough to send me a copy of. Everybody who's watching this should be buying this book, people. I haven't read it yet.
That cover comes from a Christian document of the Middle Ages called Las Cantigas de Santa Maria, which is a wonderful piece of art. It's poetry and illustrations and music. It's an extraordinary combination. You think we invented that in the 21st century? No. In the Middle Ages, they were already doing that. Right. That manuscript has poetry, has written music as well, and has illustrations. 3 kinds of art.
Very cool. My wife was actually asking me, so which books are you going to take on? We're leaving in a few weeks on our family vacation, and I usually take a couple of books to try to read while I'm on vacation and catch up as I'm reading. And she said, no, please don't bring this book. I want you to stay away from Islam. I want you to go on vacation. So I was planning on bringing this book on vacation, but my wife might veto my decision.
But you may still. Are you taking your computer?
I am taking my computer.
Well, you can always read it in Kindle.
Fair enough. And she doesn't have to know what I read, correct?
Exactly. You just there to your computer.
There you go. Okay, let's take everything that we're talking about and see sort of some of the downstream effects of what you discovered in your book and what you discussed in your book in a contemporary setting. How do some of these things manifest themselves in the way we talk about these issues today?
Well, one thing that I have noticed is that the Islamic Caliphate of al-Baghdadi is using these methods that I have been reading in the Christian chronicles, like the Chronicle 754, which describes the shock and awe tactics, and then even the Muslim chronicles later describe it as well. And he's using these tactics. I mean, look at the remarkable success of the Islamic Caliphate of al-Baghdadi. In less than 2 years, it conquered an enormous amount of territory. It's like you're seeing here a reproduction of something that happened centuries ago, the same kind of extraordinary success.
Of course, by the way, given that you're talking about al-Baghdadi, the typical answer that you'll get from the same Western apologist is a variation of the no true Scotsman fallacy. Well, but he's no true Muslim. They're not real. They're not following Islamic doctrine. So here we've got a world expert telling us that what ISIS is doing is no different than exactly what was happening in the Middle Ages.
Which, by the way, doesn't mean that those medieval scholars, those very learned scholars, were not wrong. Maybe they were wrong.
Right.
Their interpretation of the Quran and the prophets today are right.
Okay. This smells a lot of political correctness here, because it seems that there's 1,400 years of misinterpretation of true Islam in exactly the same direction. What an extraordinary coincidence.
It's possible. And that the people didn't know what they were doing, just as al-Baghdadi doesn't know it.
Yes. Other than the fact that he's got a PhD in Islamic studies, right?
I'm not sure. Does he?
Yeah, he does. He does. PhD in Islamic studies, but he probably doesn't know anything about Islam. Okay, so how do we apply some of the stuff that we're talking about to some of the fundamental questions that keep many politicians up at night? For example, Islamic immigration, right? So I've repeatedly talked about this on the show with guests regarding how do we strike the right balance between being humane, remaining an open society, letting people who are worthy of being safe in our societies, but also recognizing that they bring with them cultural and religious values that may not be consistent with our secular, liberal, modern values. Do you have a sense, based on all of your writings, how we might be able to tackle this apparently intractable problem?
Well, it's a tremendous dilemma, and you put it well, humanitarianism and self-preservation. I have not studied this problem the way I have studied, scholarly speaking, the issue of the Islamic conquest, the destruction of the Visigoth kingdom. I have a whole chapter, by the way, on the Visigoth kingdom, showing that it was very advanced. Most American scholars, English scholars in general, dismiss it. So there's not enough evidence about it. It was, we don't know much. Yes, we know a lot about the Visigoths, and it was an extraordinary kingdom. But I have not studied this issue, scholarly speaking. So all I have is, what you read in the newspapers, the news that you get, the blogs that one reads. I have not researched the matter. It would seem that it stands to reason that those who come into Western countries should be carefully screened. The problem is that how do you screen people coming from societies where you cannot get records?
But even if you had the records, see, to me, it's much more serious than that, because even if I've got every possible record that you could think of, I can't know what's in your heart. I can't know what's in your mind. Not only that, even if what's in your heart and mind is perfectly congruent with my values today, I don't know if your interaction with some particular text tomorrow might kindle some new trajectory that might be inconsistent with my values. And therefore, I don't think it's just a matter of, whether we have accurate records or not. It's how could you... Anyways, go ahead.
How do you have your warranty? Like, I'm reminded of those funny questions you used to get in visa applications to come to the United States. Have you ever been a communist? Remember that?
Right, of course.
So what are you going to write there? Yeah, I've been a communist. No, you're not going to write you've been a communist sympathizer ever or whatever. No, you're not going to write that. So yeah, that's a problem.
Now you're originally from Spain?
No, I wasn't born in Spain.
Okay.
I was born in Cuba.
Oh, you're Cuban. Okay. Because I was going to ask you if you could comment, given your sort of your research, on some of the realities, in the field in Spain, because apparently now it's starting to get heated up in Spain in the same way that it has in France and in some of the Scandinavian countries, where there's a lot of friction between, the sort of the indigenous Spanish population and the hordes of, migrants coming in. Can you comment on that?
Which reminds me, that situation is a little bit redolent of what the Spaniards were facing in the late 16th and early 17th century. You see, after the Reconquest was finally successful, or as it proceeded south, masses of Muslims left for North Africa, but others chose to stay. And for some centuries, they were allowed to practice their religion in their own neighborhoods. Then in 1492, the last Muslim kingdom fell. And so the whole of Spain now was back under Christian monarchy. But there were still substantial Muslim populations in Spain. Now, through the centuries, even those Muslim populations that had been allowed to practice their religion in their towns, there had been some rebellions, some sublevaciones, some revolts. And the problem for the Spanish government was that there was this tremendous Islamic danger outside of Spain. We have already mentioned the Turks. We have already mentioned the North African Muslims. So some people forget that the fear of Islam then was greater and more justifiable in a way than even the fear of Islam today, because Islam was really a power then. The Caliphate of the Turks had probably the largest armies in the entire world. And it had already conquered the whole of Eastern, most of the Eastern, the Balkans and Hungary and Greece and the Middle East. It was a tremendous danger. So there was this fear of the collusion of these Muslims inside Spain with the Muslims outside of Spain, which were advancing against Europe and which were raiding constantly the coasts of Europe and attacking ships in the Mediterranean. So and then there was also the danger from the Protestant countries who might be helping these Muslims inside Catholic Spain subvert the Catholic kingdom. So there was danger from the Muslims, but also from the enemies of Spain among the Protestant nations. So in the 15th century, early 15th century, I think it was 1520s, and remember again, the Turks were advancing against Europe. The Muslim pirates were attacking the coast of Spain. The monarchs decided to force these Muslims who had carried out revolts, several revolts inside. You either assimilate or you leave. So they gave them the choice of converting to Christianity or leaving. And by the way, this approach had already been used by the Muslims. The regime of the Muslim Almoravids, they had also expelled hundreds of thousands of Christians to North Africa for analogous reasons. They were afraid of the collusion of the Christians under Islamic power with the Christians from the north who were advancing the reconquest. So they didn't take any chances, like some gangster movies. You cannot take chances. So they expelled hundreds of thousands of Christians to North Africa. And the following dynasty, the dynasty of the Almohads, went further. They decided to cortar por lo sano, as they said. You either convert or we expel you to North Africa. So they forced the conversions of all Jews and Christians. Those who didn't either had to flee north if they could, or they were kicked to the north, or to North Africa.
Well, there's something. Is there something? There's something playing in your computer?
No, it's some phone, the phone. Let me cut the phone there.
Okay, all right.
Somebody trying to sell me some stuff on my kitchen or something. I don't know.
All right, go on. Yeah.
So this method of you either assimilate or you are kicked had already been pioneered by the Muslim regime. The Almoravids, you have to go to North Africa. The Almohads, you either convert or you go to North Africa. So now the monarchs told these Muslims, they were called mudejares, these Muslims under Christian control, you either assimilate by converting or you have to go to North Africa.
I mean, so there is a way that we could sort of contextualize what you're talking about in a current setting, not so much in forcible conversion as a form of assimilation, but rather eradicating the political philosophy of multiculturalism that says, who are we to force others to assimilate to our values? Well, if you eradicate that version of multiculturalism, I don't mean multiculturalism as having multiple ethnicities. I mean multiculturalism as a political philosophy. Well, then in a sense, you are replicating what happened back then, but not by forcing people to convert, but by forcing them to assimilate. No, it is not okay for you to have female genital mutilation if you say that this is part of your religion.
Which, by the way, the juridical texts of Islamic Spain call the circumcision of men obligatory and the circumcision of women honorable. All the texts call it so, and there is even a biography of a jurist in which the jurist is consulted whether the touching of the two circumcised organs requires purification before carrying out some kind of Muslim activity. So you can see how the female circumcision was part of the culture of Islamic Spain. But going back to the point you're making, you earlier said that it's even very difficult to get into the mind of someone who says, yeah, I'm with you and so forth. And the Spanish government found that out because, as I said, a lot of these Muslims decided to convert. but many of them converted only in order to stay. And they were called Moriscos. These now Christian Muslims were called Moriscos. But what happened? There were several uprisings of Moriscos as well. And the danger continued from the Caliphate of the Turks and the pirates from the north of Africa and the collusion with Protestant countries. So these presumably assimilated Muslims actually continued to practice their religion in secret.
So would this be these Moriscos, as I'm not sure if I'm using the right plural.
The Moriscos. That's where the Moriscos.
Right. So would they have implemented that duplicity through the Islamic mechanism of taqiya? Is that what was effectively happening?
That could be the mechanism that they were using. Yes, and what happens is that Islamic Spanish scholars who don't know about what you just mentioned have never mentioned that in their accounts of the Morisco situation. So what the Spanish did, and some of these rebellions were serious. The Spanish army had some difficulty putting them down. There were, there's some good leaders, some of those Moriscos. So the Spanish government decided to expel them, period. So they expelled hundreds of thousands of these presumably Christian people to North Africa. And that was the end of it.
Interesting. Earlier you mentioned, and it reminds what I'm gonna say in a second what you mentioned and link it to something contemporary. You mentioned the alliance between the Muslims and the Protestants. Well, I could draw an analogy today between Islam, the unholy alliance between Islam and the leftists, right? In other words, they are both, in the same way that back then both of those groups would have been against the Catholics for different reasons, for their own theological reasons. Today, the Islam and the leftists are united in their shared hatred of the West, of capitalism, and so on. And each thinks that let's get to bed together, and then when we get rid of that other big monster, then we could kill off the other, right? And so in that sense, it's an unholy alliance. There's a great book by Jamie Glazoff. I don't know if you know him. He's a historian who is Canadian, but who's now left to California. And he wrote a book called United in Hate that specifically talks about going to bed, the going to bed or sleeping in the same bed between the Islamists and the leftists. What do you think of that?
The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So writing in that kind of analogy, I think that yes, a lot of people in the West create this exceptionalism for even some of the more extreme versions of contemporary Islam because they hate a lot of what they see in the West, and they are quick even to say, well, we have this extremism precisely because of the West. There's all this poverty that the West creates, and all this exploitation, and of course they go that way because of the West. So the West is always, to blame.
To blame, right? All right. Of course, I could keep you here as I tell all my guests for another 5 hours, but we need to end it at some point. So maybe you could tell us any projects that you're currently working on that are not yet publicized that you'd like to use this forum to talk about.
Well, yes. I'm now engaged in an ant work, which is translating my book into Spanish.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Because it's going to be published in Spain. So that thick volume you see there, now I regret having written so many pages, especially so many notes in such small print.
Now, so you're going to be actually the one who's translating it?
I'm already doing it. I've already translated the first chapter.
Okay. Well, now, why is it that can't be done? Now, I appreciate what you're doing because I'm somebody who is horrible at delegating anything because I always think that nobody can do it with as much assiduousness as I could. Is that your reason?
Yes.
Okay. Well, got it. So when will the Spanish version be out?
I don't know. It depends on me.
Right.
It depends on how if I can finish this translation then first the translation, then the publication.
Any other projects or any other? Is there a website where you're, other than your university website, anything else that you'd like to promote?
There is going to be a collection of articles on the myth of the Andalusian paradise in an electronic journal called I Humanista, and I don't know when it's going to come out. So I'll be one of the contributors in that issue of I Humanista.
Wonderful.
So those are the two projects that I have in my hands now. But I tell you, this translation is brutal. Translating this thing, it's just brutal because there are so many languages involved and all these little notes. Just I don't know why I wrote this.
I tell people that when I receive the galley proofs of any of my works, whether it be a paper, but certainly when it's a book, usually people, when they receive the galley proofs, they're happy because it's almost the end of the process. Whereas for me, it's an incredibly anxiety-ridden situation because being maladaptively perfectionist, this is the time where it's my last shot to catch any mistakes, any commas that are in the wrong place. So the amount of stress that it causes me, that this is it. If I don't catch the errors now, they will forevermore be immortalized. So I truly empathize with your upcoming project of translation.
Yes, thank you. It's hard, but it's got to be done.
Right.
Somebody has to do it, so better do it myself.
Well, as we say in French, bon courage, good courage. Wishing you the best. Stay on the line, Dario. It was a real pleasure and honor to talk to you. And I'll probably have it posted later today. Thank you so much, Dario. Stay on the line. My pleasure. Cheers.